Okay, great. Right, so impact. What do we even mean by impact? So I just want to start off the session by just giving a little bit of a, just kind of acknowledging that jargon is always, can always be a barrier, and you get that in any sector, but it can be useful to come up with, you know, shared terminology so we know what we're talking about, you know, what maybe your funders are asking for and other stakeholders. There are various glossaries that you can use, but in terms of impact for these purposes, it's the idea of the change or the difference that you're making as an organization. And obviously change is happening all the time, and sometimes in very abrupt and extreme ways, as we're seeing now. Change can be very complex, especially when you're dealing with people, and it can be hard to capture. But coming back to the reasons that you've set up your organization, the reasons that you exist, it's because you want to make a difference. So when we talk about impact management, impact measurement, what impact is trying to capture is the change that you are influencing, that you are contributing to. So we often, you might hear terms like outputs, outcomes, impact. When we talk about impact more broadly, it will refer to those kind of longer term or macro effects. It can be both positive and negative. So you need to be conscious of whether the activities and services that you're running, if are they doing any harm, and both unintended and intended. So you need to keep an eye out for all sorts of changes that might be happening that you might not have planned for. We are starting to see, and I think more so in, especially in sort of impact investment and sort of social enterprise space, sometimes seeing impacts used in the plural, which means something slightly different, and can mean, so impacts in the plural is basically breaking down, if you're looking at the different outcomes, results, changes that you're trying to contribute to. Impacts is trying to think about the amount of change within that outcome that you're contributing to. I'm mentioning that here, I think within the small charity sector and the language that you use to communicate, you know, with each other and with funders, we still understand impact as that kind of that sort of longer term, bigger picture understanding. Ultimately, how do we know if we're making a difference and not just kind of going on our hunches and going on our assumptions? And that's where the measurement piece comes in. But before you think about measuring, it's important to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. So I now just want to give you all a chance to think about, well, what is actually the point of measuring? What are the benefits to measuring? And specifically, they'll be different for depending on kind of where you sit in the sector and where your organization is. But there's a reason that you've signed up for this session today. So we're going to have a little go. Angela's going to share a link in the chat. This is another digital tool which you might have used before. So Angela will share a link in the chat. Alternatively, you can just go to menteecom and type in this code. And simply, I just want you, it's an open-ended answer, and you can submit as many answers as you like, and just share a few thoughts as to why you think, you know, what are the good reasons to measure? What are the benefits of measuring impact? So just have a think. If Mentimeter isn't working for you, you can add, if you're happy to, you can share your reasons in the chat function. So I'll just give you a few minutes to think about that. Okay, great. Some good answers coming in. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going into Mentimeter so that you can take a look. Angela, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the Mentimeter screen? Great. Okay, so this is just free text. So let me just move your faces. So we've got check that no harm is being done, for learning, for improvement, two of my favorites, understanding effectiveness, see how we're making a difference, feedback to service users, such an important one. Ultimately, if you think about accountability, there's always, you always feel like you're being held accountable by your funders, or where the money is coming from, but really accountability should, it's service users who should, who are the most important stakeholders in all of this. See how we're making a difference, measuring difference between start and finish, providing evidence of change, so seeing that distance travelled, funder requirements, sort of managing services, proving to funders that your idea works and they should fund more, showing impact to funders, check if your original intentions are still working, see if we're making a difference again. Some really, really great things here. And what you can often do is kind of pull the reasons into two different categories. So there's the sort of the learning side of things, learning and improvement, and how effective you are, and how you can use that, how you can use the information to adapt service delivery, change service delivery, design new services. And then there's also the sort of the showing side and the proving side. And making a case to funders, feeding back to your service users, sharing your findings with other partners, and both are important. I think we will often, when small charities first come to us, it's often driven by sort of a funder demand, or they're struggling with bids and proposals. And of course, it's important to improve that quality and really communicate your impact. But for us, if it's been a successful project, because an organisation has recognised how important learning and improving and collecting data, that will feed into that and will feed into sort of more effectiveness and more efficiency. So thank you for that. We will, in the follow-up email, share all of a PDF of all of your answers. So a plug for Mentimeter, if you haven't used it before, that's another way of collecting data, and you can do all sorts of either open questions or multiple choice, and it's reasonably intuitive to use. Okay, great. Now back to the presentation. Are we back to my slides again, Angela? Great. So, what we mean by impact measurement and impact management. So you might, we've talked about monitoring and evaluation, outcomes measurement, outcomes reporting, impact assessment. But ultimately, sort of measuring and managing your impact is about being accountable for the changes that are down to us, that are down to you as an organisation striving for continuous improvement, and using your limited resources as small charities and small organizations efficiently, and really focusing on what's important to to those we exist to serve, helping to bring that clarity to our social mission and our social purpose. And if you think about sort of a charity's accounts, or an organization's financial accounts, it really only tells a part of the picture, because you can be brilliant at fundraising and you can be brilliant at delivering a huge number of services, but if those services aren't actually making a difference to your service users or aren't what your service users need, then you are, you can't really describe yourself as an impactful and effective organization. So really, impact measurement and management and your impact practice, as far as we're concerned, is as important, if not more important, than your sort of financial management, and should really sit at the heart of what you do. And we also talk about sort of your impact practice, and that's within an organization, how you approach it, because there are lots of different parts to this. It's not just we want to write a report that we're going to publish every year. It's going back to the beginning and planning, really understanding what is the difference that you're making. So that's sort of really coming together and making sure that there's alignment there. What do we want to measure? You can't measure everything. So how are you going to collect that information? Then you want to make sense of it. Have you got the tools? Have you got the resources to analyze that information? And then what are you going to do with it? How can you learn from it? How are you going to use that information? Are you going to sort of present that information to your board, use it to drive your strategy? And then which elements are you going to communicate, and to whom? So there's that whole cycle that we'll come back to. And Inspiring Impact, we're going to share the link in our follow-up email, and Angela might share it now as well, but it's a brilliant website, and with lots of resources, and really aimed at organisations that are lots of helpful resources for organisations that are aiming to get started, some useful worksheets, and they break it up into these 4 sections. So the sort of planning stage, where you're sort of identifying what are the issues, what's the situation, what are the issues you're looking to address as an organisation. The doing bit is sort of overlaps with your service delivery. So when delivering your services, when do you decide to collect data? Is it going to be before and after? What's that data going to look like? Is it going to be quantitative or qualitative? And then there's the assessing stage and analysing that information. And there are others in the sector who can help you with that if you don't feel that you have the skills within your organisation, if you've got a lot of data to analyse. And we've also got some learning labs on how to make sense of both qualitative and quantitative data for people who are kind of new to it. And then there's the review stage. And I think that especially this last year, and the feedback we've been getting from small organisations, and certainly our approach, is that during times of crises, and I would argue that small charities have had to work in an agile way even before COVID, but there's something about actually you wanting quite rapid cycles in terms of the doing and assessing at the moment. If you're trying new services, if you're wanting to test things out. So I wouldn't say that this cycle is broken up into a sort of, there's a timeline of you spend a few weeks or a few months on each. The planning part is especially important, and you want to have that have a deep understanding of your purpose and where you want to head. but the sort of doing, assessing and reviewing might be a much quicker cycle at the moment, because you don't want to wait 6 months to see if your new online intervention is working or not. So it's common sense, but I think this is kind of a useful sort of steps to follow. So, and what we see in terms of, so a few of you mentioned in your reasons to measure around learning, around improvement. So, impact measurement and impact management, it's not a tick box exercise, and it's certainly not something that just one person in the organization should be doing by themselves. It might be that one person is responsible for it, but you need leadership at all levels, and you need people to take responsibility for impact, and encourage everyone around them to do the same, from trustees, directors, senior managers, frontline staff, whoever's collecting data, your volunteers as well, if they're helping to deliver services. Everyone wants to be kind of brought into that purpose, to that clear sense of purpose, and making sure that there is alignment there, and that you do revisit your mission and what your key principal outcomes are. And if there isn't alignment, then that needs to be discussed, and you might want to think about, well, is there evidence or data or information to make us want to think differently or focus on something else. This point about a learning culture, you can't really teach that in a training session or in a learning lab, and often that it comes from leadership, but you need that openness and that sort of honest culture, and just accepting that it's not all going to be perfect. There might be some negative feedback, there might be some programs or activities that you're really excited about but end up not really making much of a difference. So you just need to be sort of open to all of that, and be willing to change and willing to act on what you find. Because otherwise there's just not really any point in sort of taking your organisation through all of these steps if you're not going to do that, or if you're only doing it to pull out some a few gems to include in a report to a funder. That's not really like a proper robust approach to impact. Making sure that your different ways of collecting data, whether that's through a Zoom poll, through emails, through observations, we'll come on to the different approaches in a bit, but making sure that that they are reliable, that they're proportionate to your organisation as well, to a small organisation. The point around equitable is just sort of making sure that you're, wherever possible, making sure that you're really involving service users. Increasingly, we're seeing people with lived experience working within organisations, which is really important. So, you're really thinking about what is the appropriate way to collect this information. How are you storing it? Who's helping you design them? And then the point about using measurement for management, that's making sure that it is all feeding into to your decision making, which is why you see a bit of a mix between impact measurement and impact management. And I think the shift to calling it management is just to encourage organisations to really use the data and information they're collecting to sort of drive their strategy. On the Inspiring Impact website site, there's a code of good impact practice. So if you're interested in more of the sort of creating a good impact culture, there are some other resources on the Inspiring Impact website that can help you with that. But the fact that you're here, that you're on this learning lab, and it's about sort of sharing that with others in your team. Although sometimes it's very, very small teams within small charities. So I talked about that kind of first stage in that planning, in the cycle, which is the planning stage. And some of you might have heard the term theory of change. We're seeing it more and more. this session, we're not going to go into theory of change in detail. We've got another learning lab coming up in a couple of weeks, and there are some good resources out there to help you think about theories of change. But this is an example of a very simple theory of change, and it's quite we've had feedback from others saying it's quite a useful illustration. Also, not just to sort of understand that sort of the logic that comes with a theory of change, but also understanding that difference between outputs and outcomes, that sometimes there's a bit of confusion there. What we've got here, so if you take a look at the image, you've got the analogy of baking a cake, the ingredients, etc. as the inputs, activities of actually baking the cake, the output, the direct sort of result, the product of that activity is the cake itself. But the outcome that's what's trying to capture the change. And so for a project, inputs, and you won't always include inputs on a theory of change, that's probably going into a little bit too much detail, but it's just to sort of help you understand that flow. So all the different resources that go into helping you deliver certain activities, that might be delivering counselling sessions, the kind of the product, the result from that organisation's activities are that 10 people received counselling, and there were 10 counselling sessions. But you know, if those counsellors, if those sessions were kind of rated of poor quality, or they might not have achieved any outcomes, then it's not enough just to leave it there. It's really the sort of outcomes, really capturing what's worked and what's changed in that individual. That's really important. So when you're talking about outcomes, it can sort of changes or benefits, learning, or any other effects that result from what either a project or organisation makes or offers or provides. So if we give one of these learning labs as an example, you know, our inputs would be, well, we've got a bit of funding. we've got a bit of funding to run these. Then it's the time it's taken us to develop the slides and bring you all together, you know, all the different tools, our salaries, etc. Then the activity is actually running the session, or if we're talking about the whole program, or the different number of sessions that we are running and the number of people. Sorry, the activity is running the sessions. The outputs is the number of sessions that we've delivered, the number of people that we've reached. But the outcome, it might be that no one has learned anything and it's been a waste of time. So this is with the outcomes, that's where we're tracking, well, has there been any increase in knowledge? Do people know a bit more? Do people feel a bit more confident? Whatever it is that we kind of choose to track for each learning lab. So yeah, maybe take a minute or two to think about one of your programs or one of your activities and see if you can just kind of run through that chain, and most importantly try and see, well, where is that difference between output and outcome. And the outcome is the kind of really sort of interesting, rich session, because that links to your broader impact and what you're trying to achieve. You know, so if that changes in sort of mental well-being, more connected communities, you know, it's a whole range of different outcomes. They might be environmental outcomes. So that's just a sort of little illustration. Like I said, we'll be diving in to theory of change into in a bit more detail in a couple of weeks' time. You know, it's a sort of description of how you do good. The developmental versus descriptive, it just means that, so a descriptive theory of change is capturing a program that maybe you've already been running, or sort of describing what your organisation is doing at the moment. But it can also be used as a tool to develop a new project. So sometimes you might be asked for one in a funding bid if you want to run a new service or run a new program. So it's an opportunity for you to think through and also think about, well, what is the issue that we're trying to address? If we want to achieve change, we want to, you need to understand the situation first. And you are absolutely kind of the experts from where you stand and within your organisations, the issues that you're addressing and to support your service users. You've got those different levels. So a sort of organisation, can you capture a theory of change of the whole organisation? Sometimes that might be quite tricky, or you can only keep that quite high level if you've got programs that achieve quite different outcomes. Sometimes it's much easier if there are more connections between your different programs. But, a large organisation like Oxfam, for example, will have all sorts of different theories of change across the different countries that they're operating in. So it's up to you to decide, as a planning tool, what's going to be most useful. And it just provides that foundation both for to think about your strategy and what you want to achieve, what you're going to learn, how you're going to measure it. So you use that theory of change as a starting point, because you've identified all of those key elements. What are those key outputs? What are the outcomes? Okay, well, if we're making these assumptions that this is how it's going to go, how do we then test that and try and collect some data to see if that's working? So for us, we'll be sending you a survey after this session to get feedback from you. And to sort of to see what you've learned. In some cases, it's going to be harder, and your approach needs to be proportionate, because like I said, you can't measure and capture everything. But it's important to start with what it is that you want to know first. And both we have supported quite a few organisations to develop their theories of change, and really often it's the process that's more valuable than anything. It's also a really useful tool when thinking about culture. So if you've got just one person in the organisation who really gets impact and gets why it's important, but you need to bring your board along with you or other members of staff, then this is a really good opportunity to get everyone in the room. You can either facilitate it internally or get an external facilitator. So we have our brilliant team of volunteers who will guide small charities through that exercise. But it just helps you focus as a team and create that alignment. And they're always really interesting sessions, because it's very much the kind of the essence of what you do. And then in terms of the end product of a theory of change, it might be a pretty picture. You might want to keep it very simple. You just have a simple triangle of your impact at the top and what's feeding into it. You can get creative with it. You can have a video. That's sort of up to you. And always helpful to have a narrative document to support it, to kind of explain the process. Who was involved? Have you involved service users? What have you learned from it? What are your assumptions? So this is a really useful tool within that planning stage. So now we're moving on to the kind of the data bit. This is a quote that I stole from our quantitative data session, which is run by one of our brilliant volunteers, Measuring the Good volunteers. So thinking about, you might have all of these a beautiful theory of change and understanding of how you bring about that change within your organization, but you need to think about sort of the data, the information, the evidence to see what's working and what can be improved. So In terms of sort of data for your organisation, you know, some of it might just be testimonials and quotes and more kind of qualitative feedback, and other points of data might be quantitative, especially when it's, you know, you're monitoring and you're tracking how many users are engaging with your services. So there's always going to be a bit of a mix of that sort of story side and numbers, and both are equally important. And you don't really want one without the other. And we run sessions on each, both qualitative and quantitative. So we'll do initial kind of introduction, so what the data essentials for each, and there's obviously overlap between the two. And then we'll also do, how do you analyze that data when you have collected it? The qualitative session is fascinating as well, like how do you code sort of open answers, and how do you pull all of that together? And the digital advances, you know, and the free tools that are available for charities can really help you with that. So I'd encourage you to sign up for that. I think it's also, you know, might seem obvious, and I'm sure you're all accessing to some extent secondary data, you know, whether it's for funding bids or just secondary data about demographics in your local area. But there is lots of open source and sort of easy to access data out there. So you as an organisation don't need to collect everything. So just sort of be mindful of that, and again, we can signpost you to some useful data sets, and it might be that there are other partners who can also share their data and learning with you. And for standards of evidence, you know, just make sure that what you're trying to do is proportionate to the size of your organisation. So you don't want to sort of, you know, just do nothing and merely just track the stay at the output level. I think you do want to push yourselves and see, well, what is that? Can we try and capture that change? Can we try and capture those outcomes? You know, at the same time, keep it proportionate and enough precision for the decision, I've heard. So yeah, just try and think about, well, what is it that we know? There might be certain things that you think, well, look, we know that program works. And so maybe it's about pooling more resources into a new program or another project where we're not, and where you might have some kind of hunches where you want to test your assumptions. And then just, you know, the point about ethics in how you collect that data, how you store it, what you do with it. Someone mentioned earlier about sort of feeding back to service users, so making sure that how you collect data doesn't just feel really extractive to the service users, just because, you know, and I think we've probably all felt it, that, you know, just collecting data so it can be fed into a funding report. And, you know, I think we all recognise that that's important, but are there ways that you can be, whether it's feeding back to service users or doing it in a way that actually feels kind of meaningful for the service users themselves, might give them a chance to reflect. So kind of really think about that, the sort of the ethics behind it. So these just long list here of different tools. Really, the purpose of this list is to help you recognise that, you know, I'm sure that you already are collecting data, maybe not using all of these different tools. We'll cover these in more details in future learning labs. But you know, routine data is often overlooked, because it might not explain sort of the changes and the short or long-term effects of an activity. But I think especially during times like these, it's really important, it's really crucial to make sure that you are just keeping on top of that routine data collection. You know who you're reaching, you have an idea of who you're not reaching, and so don't lose sight of that, just sort of the routine data when you're trying to chase that outcome data. It is really important, an important foundation. Surveys, SurveyMonkey, all sorts of different forms that are available online. You can collect both qualitative data and quantitative data. So you can have, kind of distance traveled, you can have scales, you can have open questions. And we focus a whole learning lab on helping you to design those design surveys, because they're a very useful tool with challenges and their survey fatigue and all the rest of it, but they're a useful tool, especially to get that sort of breadth of information. Just observations, conversations, how can you think of creative ways to try and track that, especially at the moment? What kind of systems can you use? More in-depth conversations, interviews, focus groups, which I think are a bit of a struggle to do remotely. We also run a session on them. More creative methods, and if you work with maybe kind of vulnerable people with learning disabilities, maybe children, young children, you might want to think of slightly different ways of collecting information. Whether it's gamifying it or asking people's carers to feed in. Social media, I think, has been a really useful way to collect data this last year or so. Whether it's through different Facebook groups, and just sort of getting feedback from your community and seeing what works. This is a really, really useful framework that was developed by the team at Inspiring Impact. And we always come back to this because I think that it's a really useful way of trying to understand and break down the different data points that you're looking for. So rather than just thinking there's output data and then the outcome data, this helps you really break down. So those first three levels of user data, engagement data, and feedback data are actually reasonably sort of certainly less challenging to collect, and they can tell you a huge amount. So user data, just basic information on the characteristics of who you're reaching. So for us, that would be knowing about you, which organization you're from, roughly how big you are, how many members of staff, what you're focusing on. Typically, you would save that in your kind of CRM or whether it's your Excel database, wherever it is that you kind of pool all of that information. We've started to use Salesforce recently, maybe mailing lists as well. You can have that information there, and using MailChimp or whatever mail list you use. Then the next level up is where you've got all that sort of basic service user information, but what if they're just not actually engaging with your service? You want to understand the extent to which they are actually engaging with you. So how are you able to track that properly? So this is sort of back to that routine data collection. It might be through booking systems, your finance systems, coming back to your CRM as well. Then we've got feedback data, which I think is incredibly valuable. You learn so much, and it's that sort of direct conversation with your service users, which is why it's so important to always close that loop and feedback to them as well. And you can collect that through, different survey tools, sending surveys after a session, or if you have, a center, you can collect feedback that way, or just through conversations. I think you can be quite creative with feedback. Then it starts to get a little bit harder. So there's the outcomes data, and some outcomes data will be more sort of easier to collect than others. And you can also use surveys to track outcomes data, making sure you've really thought through, well, what is the outcome, what is the change that we're trying to monitor here, to learn from. Focus groups, interviews, that sort of other ways, more in-depth interviews or other ways, developing case studies of trying to draw out that information. There are other sort of hard outcomes that might be easier to track. So if you're looking at educational attainment, you know, exam results and things like that, that will be sort of slightly easier to pull together. And then impact data, small charities are rarely, it comes back to those standards of evidence and what's proportionate for you, but, you know, small charities will, you know, maybe if you're part of a larger impact analysis or research project, you might be feeding into much sort of bigger impact data, but for the purposes of your own impact practice, your approach to impact management, it's about sort of focusing on those first 4 levels. So we've talked about some of the sort of the tools and approaches within the sort of planning and doing. So you may have used, you know, whether it's a theory of change exercise or some reflective exercise to really think about your impact and sort of and that planning phase. You've collected some data. You might have trialed out a new way of collecting data, and then it's the assessing stage, which we're not going to go into during this session, but it's pulling together, whether that's information from results from your surveys, results from your interviews, pulling it all together, trying to kind of group it and draw some insights from it. And then coming back to the review section, what are you going to do with those insights, and how will you learn from it? How will you improve your service delivery? Who are you going to communicate those learnings to? So I am going to stop sharing my screen. These are just a few tips, and they might sort of feel quite obvious to you now, but just sort of pulling together what we've been hearing from other organisations. That importance, especially at the moment where things are changing all the time. Be agile. You know, maybe don't sort of plan your impact collection for the next 12 months, but, you know, sort of prioritize what do you need to know now for the sort of next few weeks, next few months. Make sure that data collection is proportionate. It's enough to make those decisions, that it's feasible and safe and ethical, the ways that you're collecting that data. Make sure that you're always just coming back to your purpose and to those outcomes. And sharing your achievements and learning and successes, both internally and if you have time externally. We are pulling together a sort of 1-page impact sheet, almost like an impact report, recognizing that small organizations don't have the time and resources to develop really detailed, glossy impact reports. So we are developing a resource for small charities to just kind of pull everything together on 1 page, which you can adapt for your different stakeholders. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, just, you know, sort of keep building your knowledge and skills by attending our learning labs. There are other sessions, inspiring impact run sessions too. There are workshops on how to improve your kind of Excel skills run by our partner Superhighways. So there are all sort of different ways that you can build your team's knowledge and skills. Lots of resources out there as well. So, and in terms of how we can help you, there are our learning labs. We run impact chats. So this was our sort of lockdown. We started running these during the first lockdown all those years ago. And it's just a 1-hour conversation with either myself or Angela, and to help you, probably not dissimilar to the chat you were having in your breakout groups, but just sort of help think, well, what are some quick wins? What can you do now? There are all sorts of free resources available, and we're currently able to offer them for free thanks to the lottery, and we're going to try and secure more funding because they've been a really successful initiative. Because our other program, our sort of flagship program, Measuring the Good, is where we take small organizations through that kind of whole process. And it's very flexible, so it's designed so that you can fit it in around your kind of busy schedules, but it's a more involved program. So there are 6 steps to it. We match you to one of our brilliant sort of volunteer coaches who work alongside us to support you and your team to go through those steps. You know, think about your purpose, your theory of change, review how you're collecting data, identify those key measures. And so we can share more information about that program. But impact chats are quite a good way of sort of starting and getting to know us a bit better and our approach. And like I said there, we're able to offer them for free. And yeah, and we're really proud. We've got a 4.9 out of 5 star rating. And this sort of feedback, and we just do it through sort of SurveyMonkey after each conversation. We started running these using our core funding, and we use this kind of feedback in both quantitative and qualitative data to access a bit of funding from the lottery to carry on running them. So that's a sort of COVID lockdown initiative that we're really proud of. I'm not going to go through all of these, just so you know, at the end of your slide deck, that's where we've added some more resources and links and some of the things that we've shared. And I'll include some extra ones in the email as well. And one in particular is our impact framework. So I will, which it's basically kind of an impact framework template for organisations to make their own. If anyone wants to look at that in a bit more detail, I'm happy to run you through it if you're able to stay on, or if you have any questions about it, just get in touch. So quickly before we go, I just want you to think about, can you think of one sort of pledge, a sort of small step that you can take in the next week or so to help you develop your impact practice? So something that you can improve on, maybe a quick win. Have a think about it, and if you're willing to share it in the chat, then please do, or you can unmute yourselves and share it with everyone else. So just have a think. What can you do in the next 7 days? It might be as simple as just sharing what you've learned with some of the team, looking more closely at some of the resources.